Hello, I'm Jordan. I'm studying art at Illinois Central College, and my project this semester was to make a lamp. In this video, I'll be discussing my creative process from conception to inspiration to construction and all the way to my final product. Hold on to your hats. In terms of art, I've had very little experience in the third dimension. I took a ceramics class in high school and toyed with model magic as a little kid, but this is the first time I've ever created a sculpture of this scale and medium. I've worked far more in 2D design. I'm a graphic design student, I draw, I paint, and I love to render my own digital art. And all of that experience was essential to this project. I've always wanted to learn how to sculpt animals either in clay or as puppets, and this project was a solid gateway to that. My lamp is a head bust of Blue, a velociraptor from the Jurassic World series. I'm a big fan of Jurassic Park as a whole, and on a much wider scale, dinosaurs are a huge special interest of mine, and a huge subject in many of my proudest works of art, and a huge reason I'm an artist in the first place. I've always loved Blue's design and found that I could play with her eyes and distinctive asymmetrical stripes as a vessel for light of some sorts. However, I didn't come up with this idea until far into the semester. None of my original thumbnail sketches match the end product, the only one even closely resembling my final idea being this weird-looking dragon. Not that any of these couldn't have turned out great, but I didn't feel particularly excited for any of them, and that's probably why it took me so long to start. I sketched what I thought just made sense, what was plausible or safe, or what I should be making. It wasn't until I took a step back at my most basic passions that I realized the opportunity that I had. Like I said, I've always wanted to learn how to sculpt animals, especially dinosaurs, and even if I needed to make it a source of light, I could learn some new techniques and knew where to get great inspiration. I looked, of course, to Jurassic World and some behind-the-scenes material about Blue's animatronic in Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom. My biggest inspiration, however, comes from the works of YouTuber Dead Sound, aka David Armsby. I adore his animated short films, and especially his behind-the-scenes videos, where he showcases his own art and creates sculptures for his characters. The techniques he goes into detail specifically in his How I Sculpt My Dinosaurs video were a very prominent source for my first sculpture here. The original sketch maquette for my lamp was a lot more vertically standing, using a coil pot technique to make a large thick neck and head that I'd place over an upright light bulb. I bought a ton of clay and most of my supplies already, then created a light stand out of oven clay and acrylic paint, and wired it all together. It was at this point that I started to realize the idea wouldn't work. Not only would it be implausible, it would be dangerous. But this realization was slow, and I spent a lot of sleepless nights paranoid about how I could salvage the idea, or if I'd be able to make it in time. But in the meantime, I sculpted the general shape of the head, starting with an armature made of layers of wire, cardboard, masking tape, and even some bubble wrap for filler on the inside. I went over it all with a thin layer of air-dry clay, not focusing on detail, but just the general rough shape, and left it to dry. I was still prepared to make the giant vertical version, but as I kept running through ideas in my head and ways to make it work when I clearly had no true direction, I took a step back and decided to go more horizontal. I had the head, so I went on to sculpt the extension, the back of the head and the start of the neck. This would be hollow, and I could insert the light sideways, and while the head was a bit more lightweight with the cardboard and armature inside, this piece was all solid clay, much heavier and allowing the head to drape over a bit. Then, after drying and gluing the pieces together, I built up the sculpt more and more, adding fresh clay and sculpting out scales, wrinkles, and imperfections. Among some basic sculpting tools, I created my own stamp for the scales, this mushroom made of air-dry clay. This was directly inspired by Dead Sound's methods and allowed me to cover a lot more of the sculpt in a short period of time, then going in to sculpt more varied detail. It was during this process when I inserted the eyes and stripe holes. The eyes are made out of resin. I made an oven-baked clay eye and stamped it into a blob of silicone putty, which became my mold. One after the other, I poured my epoxy mixture with yellow dye and left them to cure for a little over 48 hours. Originally, my plan was to use sheets of colored lighting gel plastic for the eyes, which is exactly what I did for the stripes, until a good friend suggested otherwise. Shout out to you, Katie. I'm glad I took that advice, because not only did I learn another new skill, but the extra dimension in these resin models bring up the design far higher than what I had initially planned. Once the sculpt was all finished, I sanded a few rough edges and got to paint. A starting layer of flat gray acrylic, then added value and other colors over top, all inspired by Blue's design. The asymmetry here in Blue's stripes, with one side going over her eye and the other not, it is screen accurate, though not perfectly replicated. I also painted over the eyes and blue gel to add extra dimension and value when the light shines through, and this is where a bit of me pours into the lamp a bit. A large part of my aesthetic, even in my digital paintings, is this visible, messy paint stroke texture you see here. After adding the finishing touches, I set my lamp on a wooden circular stand I had painted when I had the original design in mind, dressed it with some fake ivy, ferns, and leaves, and now have the finished product you see here. Looking at it here, and while making it, I've got my fair share of problems with the piece. The whole thing is pretty off-model. The eyes, despite being the same height, look positioned differently from the way I sculpted both sides, and you can't see the eyes in frontal view, which is the case for Blue. However, for my very first air-dry clay sculpture, and the first time I've ever concerned over modeling and detailing out something of this scale with a relative bit of accuracy and competent direction, I'm incredibly happy with this piece. The closest to this I've done before was this little Tyrannosaurus pinch pot I made in my high school ceramics class. Comparing this with my Blue lamp, especially considering the inspiration behind both, it's just night and day. It's incredible how much I learned from this project. And it's also just really cool as a lamp. I wish my video quality could do the light justice, especially the yellow, blue, and somewhat green patterns that it projects onto the wall with the leaves. It turned out way better than I expected. Most of all, I enjoyed making this. A lot of personal and external struggles this year took a huge toll on my mental health, and my motivation to create with it. But this project, once I turned it into something more personal and fun, and something that I was really looking forward to do, it was a really fun experience, creating and transforming it into the coolest thing I've made all year. And with all I've learned from this project, the possibilities are pretty endless. I can't wait to try my hand at more sculptures and more ambitious projects. And that's about it. Well, thank you for sticking around.